I drew this piece back in 2009. I would have been around 15 at the time, and I remember being really proud of this piece. Not only did I rarely draw backgrounds, but the fact that you can see both eyes and both hands in this illustration is kind of incredible. I used to do this weird technique where I would do little white gel pen dots to distract from the streakiness of my markers. I drew this piece again in 2016. I would have been around 22 at the time, and I was really trying to show off how much detail I could manage to fit into one illustration. Granted, the proportions and the storytelling behind the piece kind of fell short. It's a beautiful piece to look at, but it's not really telling the viewer anything interesting. Now today, I am showing you this piece that I drew between the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020. I wanted to share a little bit of what I've learned over the past 10 years and how my personal growth has translated into my growth as an artist. I thought sharing some of these lessons with you guys will help remind you that all artists start somewhere, and this is how I got my start. So here we go. The first thing that I've definitely learned over the course of 10 years is a lesson that I've learned many times, and that is not to skimp on the planning phase. In my early work as an artist, and honestly even still sometimes today, I rush through to the finished product, and I don't always spend enough time thinking about the concept or the story that I'm trying to tell, or even the emotion that I'm trying to provoke. And what that resulted in the first 2 times I drew this piece is a beautiful piece that is kind of boring to look at. Once you get past the pretty girl in the red dress, there's not a whole lot of substance to this piece. And that's what I wanted to change. So I spent a lot of time in this most recent illustration just planning out the piece itself. I tried to think more about the story that I was trying to create, and I ended up creating a more secretive, mysterious kind of element to the piece that is apparent through the character's expression and her pose, as well as the lighting and the colors around her. It's sort of like she's hiding something and we don't know what it is yet. You'll also notice I'm doing the sketch digitally, which allowed me to take a lot more risks and take some shortcuts where it's necessary too, which is another important lesson. You don't always have to do things the hard way. In fact, you shouldn't, and you should always try and be efficient when and where you can, because your time is valuable and you're still a good artist even if you take some shortcuts every once in a while. Next, the coloring. Honestly, I don't think much has changed about the way that I color in the past 10 years. The funny thing is, I'm using some of the same markers that I used in the original illustration. I've had some of my Copic markers for over 10 years, and I still use them, and they're still in good shape. Granted, some of them are in a little bit of a state of disarray, but the fact that they're still usable really proves that it's important to invest in an art supply and to treat your art supplies with love and to put the effort into maintaining them so that they will be with you for years to come. Similar to a point that I've already mentioned, I think another tip that I have that I definitely implemented in this piece here is to take breaks. I definitely did not sit down and do all of this coloring in one go. I would take short 10 to 20 minute breaks where I would kind of step back and walk away from the drawing and then come back and try and take a look at the big picture to see what was working and where I needed more shadows and more highlights, and if the colors that I was planning on using would work together. Also, something that's not shown is the swatches that I had going in my sketchbook, where I would experiment with different color combinations before using them in the final piece. This is definitely not something that I did in the first two illustrations, and it's something that I cannot recommend enough. You don't want to ruin a piece by taking a risk that you can't undo. So by planning out my colors ahead of time and trying to think more thoughtfully about the colors that I use in the illustration, rather than reaching for a new marker every time I move on to a different area of the piece, I try and think about how I can incorporate similar colors throughout the piece to make it look cohesive. Another area of this piece in particular that I was really trying to focus on was contrast. This is something I struggle a lot with in my work, and it's something that I am desperately trying to improve in my artwork now. I tend to shy away from really dark darks and really light lights, and a lot of my illustrations just sort of end up getting washed out by a bunch of midtones. So I really tried to be mindful of pushing my darker values in this piece, as well as intentionally leaving some areas white by not coloring on them at all, just to further intensify that contrast. I think I did this best on the character herself, but I still struggled with it a little bit in the background. By no means is my illustration in this video perfect. I think a lot of things in my artwork have improved over the past 10 years, and one thing that's improved is my ability to recognize my own mistakes. When I did that first illustration back in 2009, I thought it was perfect. I thought it was the best illustration I would ever do. I had a similar naive reaction to the drawing that I did in 2016. When I looked at the two side by side, it was so clear how much that I improved that I couldn't immediately see any flaws with the drawing in 2016 either. It's not until now when I look back at that piece that I see the flaws in the pose and the anatomy, and I see how much is lacking in the storytelling behind the piece. So those are all things that I tried to keep in mind for this piece, and even still when I look at this piece, I can see some issues with the anatomy and the perspective and areas where I could have pushed my darks even darker. Another thing that's really interesting when I compare the 2020 piece to the 2016 piece is I actually did less details in the 2020 piece. You'll notice I simplified the dress back to look more similar like the 2009 version of the illustration. I opted not to use that rose pattern because, one, I didn't feel like I really had the rendering skills to execute it convincingly with all of the folds in the skirt. And I also just sort of questioned the function that the pattern was serving on the dress. In the 2016 version, the pattern doesn't really look all that convincing. It's not really consistent enough. The sizing and the spacing is a little bit off, and it can almost be a little bit distracting rather than pulling the viewer into this world that I'm trying to create. Similar with the beading designs that I created on the skirt in the 2016 version. I sort of had to question what the point was. I think the beads on the skirt in the 2016 version are kind of like the new white gel pen dots from the 2009 illustration. It's distracting the viewer away from something rather than pulling the viewer in further. So those were details that I opted to leave out in the more recent version of this illustration. All in all, I want to be really clear about one thing. I have love for all three of these illustrations. I have held on to each version of this drawing because it means something to me. At the end of the day, it's about more than just what that final piece looks like, but also what that piece represents. Each of these illustrations represents a time in my life and a version of myself who was learning and committed to growing as an artist. The 2009 version of Amanda was a workhorse of an artist. I remember completing like 3 illustrations a day back in 2009 and diligently posting on DeviantArt and connecting with artists in the community. The 2016 version of Amanda was starting to look at art a little bit differently. I was starting to look at art as a potential business and wanting to create a brand that represented me and the business I was trying to create. That 2016 illustration ended up being on my business cards during the very first convention that I ever did. There was something about that 2016 illustration that I felt just captured and embodied my art business at that time. And I remember getting lots of compliments on it because it was a very striking illustration at first glance. 2020 Amanda is still trying to figure a lot of things out, but I still have a love for illustration, and I have a love for drawing pretty girls with long, beautiful, wavy hair. And I think the version of myself that I am now is more concerned with telling a story through my illustrations and evoking the viewer's curiosity so that they ask themselves, what's going on in this picture? And what is the story that I'm being told? Who is this character? And where is she? To further illustrate, for lack of a better word, how I did this in this illustration, I did a few key things differently. One, I really tried to push the expression to look like the character was scared or concerned in some way. You'll also notice I added a rose in her hair. This was kind of an ode to the 2016 illustration where I did the roses on her skirt, but it's also a story element. You'll notice the flowers in this illustration are hollyhocks, and the character doesn't have a hollyhock in her hair. She has a rose. So I thought this design element would tell the viewer that this character is coming from a different place than the setting she's currently in. If she was coming from this setting, she would likely have a hollyhock in her hair because those are the flowers that are in the setting that we're seeing. But she doesn't. She has a rose. The other very subtle sort of little design element that I added was a wedding ring to her left hand. I thought this might evoke some sense of mystery and secrecy that would leave the viewer guessing if she is going to see her husband or wife or fiance, or if she's going to see someone else. And I think that's really up to the viewer. I want to know what you think of when you look at this piece, and what is the story that comes to your mind. I would love to know where your mind goes when you look at this illustration and what you think of it. I also want to know what you think about the 2009 version and the 2016 version. It's totally okay if your favorite version of this piece is not the one that you're seeing on video right now. I hope to create a lot of fun and exciting videos in 2020, and that might not mean making videos every week. You guys know I started a new job in 2019 that takes up a lot of my time and energy, and I'm making a lot of changes to my workload in 2020. I've discontinued my Patreon for the time being, and I don't have any store launches immediately planned for the next couple of months. So I'm really just trying to put my effort into the art that I'm doing now and be really intentional about what I'm creating. I don't want to just put out a mindless time-lapse video where I just ramble on about anything and everything. I want to post videos that are helpful and inspiring and motivating for the people who are watching. So if you have video ideas, I definitely want to hear about them. And if anything, I hope this video inspired you to look back at your old art and revisit it, maybe even redraw it. You guys know one of my mottos is to make bad art. I love this phrase because it's sort of making light of this idea that all artists make bad art, just not all of them show it. My other motto is the progress is in the process. That means you won't get better unless you keep drawing. You're not going to improve unless you work through that process over and over again. It's a little bit more than practice because it's telling you to take a look at the process of creating and to find ways to make it more efficient and also to study your mistakes and learn from them. Hopefully these two mottos inspire you and you can take them with you into the new year. I want to thank you guys so much for watching and for continuing to support me and my channel. I hope you subscribe if you want to see more videos, and if you would like to follow me on my other social media, those links are in the description bar down below. Thank you guys. Happy New Year, and I will see you on the internet. Bye.